Hello, my name is David Fox. Welcome to another episode of the Business of Higher Ed podcast. There was a piece that was published by Dr. Dennis Johnson, and the piece was entitled "A Critical Juncture for Canadian Post-Secondary Education. Will we seize the future or let it slip away?" And today we're going to work through that article with Dr. Johnson. Dr. Johnson he has had a very long and varied career in leadership at post-secondary institutions, including Thomson Rivers University, Saskatchewan Polytechnic University, and culminating as the past president and CEO of the College of New Caledonia in British Columbia. He is now a consultant to higher education, with a focus on organizational development, improvement, strategy implementation, leadership development, and advising, board governance, and change management. So those are all things that are we're in need of in our current post-secondary world. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. And in that article, you describe Canadian post-secondary education as being at a precarious inflection point. Now, apart from just an awesome phrase, you define this moment, the precarious inflection point, as in a way a choice. That are we going to go through a period of strategic renewal, or are we going to end up into a slow decline, into a patchwork of solutions, where I think the point you're making is we're allowing the urgency of the present crisis to overtake our ability to rethink a long-term vision. This is not just belt tightening. We can't just cut our way to sustainability. You say there's a serious rethinking of how we deliver education and sustainability, of economic models, of change, new resources. We need to be nimbler, and that there's going to be discomfort. Dr. Johnson, how did we get here? How did we get here without strategic renewal? We have smart people running institutions. We have smart people in government. We've known the statistics. If we're focusing on international students, we've known the statistics about that from a long time. There's lots of resources at these institutions. How do we get here?
Well, the short answer, and it's very complex, but the short answer is we speak about post-secondary or higher education in Canada as if it's a system or a sector. But within that system or within that sector, we actually have incredible diversity. And each province, of course, and territory is responsible. It's not a federal system like so many other countries. We also have long histories of different leadership, different political parties, government decisions around funding, legislation, that sort of thing. So, the history of how we got here is varied and very diverse, but we still mostly look like the systems across Canada. There's a lot of relationships that are similar. But resourcing has been the main issue. And some provinces, although nobody's done really well in the last decade or so, there are provinces that better support higher education, post-secondary. The percentage of the budgets for institutions are still higher government public funding than in other provinces. And Ontario was the one that, of course, was the outlier with incredibly low numbers. And, it was low a decade or two ago, and it's been declining. So international came in, and it was another thing that was very uneven. So again, this larger system or sector has always had a lot of diversity, but international uh, magnified that. So in Ontario, certain institutions and the colleges, particularly through their private-public partnership model, were the largest numbers of international student growth happened. But it wasn't the only province where international students kind of came in and readjusted the budgets and the business model. But certainly Ontario was again the outlier in perhaps an overcompensation for the lack of government funding. So how we got here is a long and windy, twisty road, and it really depends. And there's so many factors like the local economy, the demographics of the institutions, decisions that were made before. You go on and on, but we are not a uniform, not even close sector.
Do you think we're at a point where academic institutions, and again, there isn't uniformity, and as you point out in your piece, there are certain institutions that already have certain, you call them halves, certain stability versus others. But do you think that we're at a point where academic institutions, their boards, their leadership, faculty, staff, are now willing to do some of the things that they weren't willing to do maybe before, they were hesitant to do before? Because the question then is why things weren't done before.
I think some are. And I think, again, it depends a lot on the local context, who's at the institution, what province they're in. One of the things I talked about in the piece is, and in an earlier piece that I posted before, is, really a lot of the future is going to come down to leadership and guidance from the provinces and from the provincial governments. And so that's a starting point. No matter how great the leadership team is at a college or a university, you're working within defined parameters. There's only so much you can do. And so there are great leaders out there, but there's only so far they can go without the blessing or the permission of government. And so, a lot of the challenges that I talk about in my piece will come down to whether government is on side or not. Now, having said that, there is a lot of internal things that leadership and not just leaders, but everybody within an institution can do to improve their institution and education overall. Adapting and adopting new methods, efficiencies, all of those things that I mentioned, a lot of that is certainly, comes down to a will and a capacity for the institution to do it and doesn't depend on government. But one of the things that often impacts how well you can do that, even if you have people that are willing, is resourcing. And unfortunately, a lot of the institutions in the next little while are going to be very much in a scarcity mindset. So leadership will still do what they can. Others will contribute, but it's a lot harder to build something when there's no resources.
What are the traits and experiences of leaders who are more likely to best position their institutions to successfully move through this turbulence? Do we need different leaders for this phase as we talk about, this period in Canadian post-secondary education? Do we expect more of leaders than we have in the past? Do we expect more training, more different skills?
Well, I think the sector's fortunate in that my experience, there are good leaders and they rise up, whether it's at the chair, dean, VP, president level. And I think for the most part, there's really good leadership within the sector. But it's a leadership where um, you're not all powerful. And
Mhm.
people that think that when you're a president, you have all this authority, um, don't really understand the job. It's there's an incredible amount of factors you need to consider in any decision making, any planning. And so I think, as far as not different leaders, but certainly I think there's a real need. I'm currently working with leaders in institutions. Um, there's a hunger and a need to understand what they could do differently.
Mhm.
It's not that they're not willing, it's just maybe they don't have the background. If you think about where institutional leadership comes in post-secondary or higher ed, typically they're subject matter experts. Maybe they were a history prof, or maybe they taught nursing, and now they're a dean, or they're a chair, or they're, a VP or a president. Um, your podcast is the business of higher ed. Not many of my colleagues over the years have actually had a business background. Um, so understanding some business principles, understanding the bigger picture, what the options are, what's worked in other institutions, that's incredibly popular. I did a presentation to a board a couple of weeks ago where I shared some of, what's happening elsewhere. Here's some lessons learned, that sort of thing. It went over very well because often they're so busy with their day-to-day challenges and just running the organization, they don't have time to lift their head up and learn about some of the things that might be done. So I don't think different leadership. I think certainly there's an opportunity for the current leadership to um, be provided more tools to deal with the change. I think that uh, it comes down to the team, not leadership as individual leaders, who's the
Right.
president, what their background is. There's so many factors that are involved in who ends up being the president at a certain time. And like I said earlier, many of them have various backgrounds, whether it's the presidents or the deans or whoever. But I think it's having that cross section of skills in the broader team, having a VP or a dean that does have that business background, having faculty, frankly, that are willing to,
Mhm.
share their business expertise. Often they've got the expertise, they're teaching it every day, they've got all that training, um, drawing them into the conversation and having them prepared to share and teach to not just their students, but also to others amongst the institution. So I think there's a broad skill set that no one individual is going to have as a leader. That they would be a unicorn. It's really can you put a strong coalition together, either at the executive table or broader,
Mhm.
and have those conversations.
Are we seeing, and have we been seeing, uh, different different paths of additional learning for those people who aspire to leadership?
Very, very, very different. And in the paper again, and I may be getting ahead of you a little bit, I talk about the haves and have-nots.
Right.
That's not a new thing, and it's not going to be just because of the loss of international revenue. It's been going on for years, and I've seen either firsthand or through associations, um, institutions that have not felt, whether you agree or disagree, they've not felt that they could invest in their leadership people to develop them. So I'm aware of people that have had, they're in a dean's role and they've never had opportunity for growth and development. They haven't taken a leadership workshop or program. There's lots of other institutions that have said this is very important, and it's part of the package. If you move into leadership, you are going to start being given opportunities to develop and to take different programs and learn from others and that sort of thing. So, um, I would argue that every institution needs to find a way, but the reality is there are some out there that have felt that, there was nothing left in the budget. And
Right.
so they sacrifice travel and professional development and all of these things. And so, yeah, we're going to become even more fragmented as, the strong institutions remain strong. Um, Institutions that were already in kind of a scarcity mindset um, will have even more difficulty attracting and then keeping the right leaders to lead them through the challenges.
You talk about the need to rethink post-secondary education in your article. Um, you talk about how do we deliver education? What resources do we have? Are there new resources such that we're not as dependent on a single source? You talk about ways towards operational sustainability. So when we talk about rethinking post-secondary education, you mentioned a few things in that last question. What are some examples? What does this look like in your mind, based on your experience leading institutions?
Well, I mean, you could just about pick any aspect of what institutions do and find opportunities to improve the model. But um, I think one of the opportunities that again the institutions that can afford it are already taking advantage of is technology. They're using technology to improve every aspect of their operation. And AI is a hot topic. You did some podcasts with guests. You talked a bit about AI. Um, AI is being used to uh, provide much faster service to students' questions, um, much more accessible. Uh, I'm no expert on AI. It's something on my to-do list to do some reading and research on. But you know, there are institutions that right now, although the vendors knock on your door almost, I still get the contacts even though I retired from the college a year ago. Um, and there's just no capacity to even think about it because the current reality is so difficult that adopting a whole new way of say providing online student service or whatever it is just it's just not a priority right now. They're just trying to get through the next little while. Um, so uh, that's technology is a huge opportunity, but also um, there's a lot of institutions that uh, we're going to see here. It's already started um, a new focus or a refocus on domestic enrollment and recruitment. And there are a lot of institutions that are really struggling, still challenged, hadn't even begun to thought about strategic enrollment management or improving their processes. So they're still fighting very antiquated application processes where students don't hear from them for weeks or months. And other institutions using technology are, can't remember the institution in the example, but something I saw recently, they respond in 8 minutes using technology to an application. So, um, you know, we could do probably 10 podcasts on just the things, the opportunities there are to look at every aspect of the operation and do continuous improvement. And it doesn't have to be a big bang, doesn't have to be a complete, you know, redo. It often the change that actually occurs in this sector is the small incremental change, but bringing in new ideas, bringing in new ways of doing business um, it's a huge opportunity. But it's more of a question of capacity. right now.
I'm familiar with the study or that was done with Canadian universities and colleges, and who responded and within how much time, and how many total follow-ups were there. And what was surprising to me was there were a number of institutions where there was no follow-up at all. There's three things in particular in your article that I believe very strongly in, but I'm interested in hearing your views. You talk about the importance of pathways, partnerships, or sharing services, I guess, and consortia. I believe very strongly in that. I don't. This is my opinion. I don't see that as an area in which there's been a huge amount, um, a large scale of that in Canadian higher education. I think I've seen more of it lately. But can we talk a little bit about the importance of pathways, the importance of partnerships, not just like in terms of sustainability?
Well, so before I get into sort of the sustainability side, I think one of the factors as to why we haven't seen more of this type of model in Canada, and I'm not saying it doesn't exist, there are
No.
examples,
Yep.
but why it's not more widespread is that there's never been an incentive to sharing curriculum, sharing students. It's a lot of this system, and I can speak firsthand from BC is even with a supportive government, which I would say that I enjoyed during my time there, that we had a province that was somewhat supportive, but a lot of the systems and process that had developed over time were around institutional metrics for our institution only. Things like targets, FTE targets, right? It wasn't about, who can you share with some other institutions, funding models for new program development, that sort of thing. Not easy to get, but when you applied, it was, you know, the system was used to looking at this institution is going to do this program, and that's what the funding request is for. Or even if you're not asking for funding, that's how it's set up for permission, a single institution. So there is some work going on. There were conversations while I was still in BC amongst the colleges, and hopefully that will. I don't think it's dead. I think there are still opportunities, but up until now, there's really been no incentive and this is where, it comes again to the provincial leadership. What does the government care about? Is there capacity within the individual ministries to understand and promote some of these new practices, some of these efficiencies, some of these different ways of doing things? And but again, going back to BC and particularly rural BC, and I think this applies across Canada in the rural areas, there's just no economies of scale to offer certain programs unless you share with another institution.
Mhm.
The interest may be too narrow, the uptake might be too small, but if several institutions get together and work on a particular new offering and offer it out in a way that is, pooling the students, and then there's a pathway to perhaps another credential after the fact,
Right.
everybody benefits. And so all of this stuff is not new. I mean, there's been literature and ideas on this stuff for a couple of decades. Um, but it's just been slow to really get traction. And there are a few leaders out there that are, forging ahead. But but again, it'll take leadership not just from, individual programs or individual deans or even individual presidents. It's going to take also a province that's supportive and says, yeah, try some things. And, we all know with innovation, you're not going to get innovation unless you're allowed to fail. So
Yeah.
that's not something that is really in our sector either. We're incredibly risk averse. And nobody wants that black eye of saying, "Oh, we tried something and it didn't work." But there's lots of good ideas out there and around pathways, around consortiums, around sharing curriculum, pooling students, and technology just makes it so much easier now to put a cohort together from anywhere, right?
I honestly, I have not, and again, I understand that there can be government reasons, there can be legal reasons. I fundamentally have never understood why there seems to have been an aversion to partnerships, but you've explained one reason why. Um, Frankly, it just does not make sense to me why this is not front and center, particularly for some of the more vulnerable schools.
And, so the elephant in the room, and, it's starting to come out, but I think we're going to see a lot more in the new year, is that the current international crisis is going to force some conversations that maybe haven't had in the past. I think there's probably some of that has already started, but I think the next year, 2025, is going to be the year that uh, determines whether um, provincial governments sort of take the lead role and start um, forcing those conversations. Because, as I allude to in the piece, as long as you end up leaving it to the individual institutions, which all have their own priorities, they all have their own boards,
Right.
they all have their local concerns, context, um, challenges, you know, we won't act like a system. Um, you do get some great colleagues that will voluntarily put something together, and it may or may not work, but you're not really going to have a system even at the provincial level, or you're not really going to have these conversations even at the provincial level unless the provincial government says um, that, thou shalt have these conversations and, here's some leadership. So the broad leadership, there's only so much you can do at the institutional level. I'm suggesting everybody needs to do their part, whether it's in the classroom or the registrar's office or the formal leadership, but also to get some of these conversations about efficiency and economies of scale and shared opportunity. That's going to take provincial leadership. You know, some of these conversations are not going to happen unless the provincial governments create the opportunity to have these conversations and create the framework. Um, the volunteers that, half a dozen presidents getting together and saying, "Hey, let's be innovative and collaborate." That's great, but without support at the provincial level, it's still going to be difficult.
But I think we're approaching for some institutions, and we won't get into them. We're getting into sink or swim territory, um, which is it has not been historically. Correct me if I'm wrong. It has not been a feature of the Canadian system, but we are. Uh, I don't think we should panic, as you said, but I think we have to recognize that we are at that point. Um, and I don't know how much more evidence, you know, uh, can be there. But, you know, I mean, the in the absence of a sink or swim, in the absence of government saying you're going to do this and supporting that, the only question left is, well, what happens to the schools that can't survive? What is their path? Because if like we have no more, we either survive or we don't. Now that can be impacted by a host of factors. Maybe that's where some provincial governments are going, which is, can there be too many post-secondary institutions based on demographics, based on geography, based on our time in history? I mean, we see what's happened in the United Kingdom with their moves in immigration reforms and impact on public education. I think Australia went to the brink and has backed off tentatively at least. Do we want these schools? Um, but also, I think a conversation is very important in schools about what schools are, what these schools are, and what they do really well. I don't think everybody should be delivering absolutely everything on the menu. And I think people are trying to do that partly from a financial perspective.
Right. So, I mean, again, back to, my earlier point near the beginning of the podcast is the institutions all come from different histories, different legislation, different mandates. If you look at community colleges generally, but, particularly BC, where most of my experience uh, in leadership was, at least in the community college system, um, they were designed to be all things to all people. They were, intended to try to bring as much access and as many options to the local community as possible. Now, again, this goes back. Most of them were created in the late 60s, the early 70s. They went through a period of growth. There was a real heyday of, program expansion. That could be a whole separate podcast in itself. Where do programs come from and what's their life cycle? Um, but they really were set up to try to serve broadly the community and they were given a geographic region. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and so now here we are in almost 2025, and the international student boom um, caused another era of expansion in many cases, growth. A lot of these institutions, you know, maybe a decade and a half ago, were seeing enrollment decline. The international students breathed new life. It wasn't just money; it was vibrancy on the campus. It was saving programs that were in trouble. It was all of those things. So now, again, I agree with you. There's a real conversation to be had about um, how many institutions uh, there. The one thing I think that is true is there will be fewer students in 2025, 2026 in post-secondary in Canada, but you know, will the haves keep the lion's share of the new
Yeah.
students domestically uh, and international, the ones that are still coming? And what will that do to the smaller institutions? Will government say, you don't need to exist anymore? I doubt
That's
that. I
that's
don't
that's
think there's, yeah, I don't think there's a political will, but what
political.
we
Yeah.
see is what's already starting, and we haven't, we're going to see a lot more next year, I think, is programs are going to get cut. The soft enrollment programs that institutions could afford to keep alive when they had international dollars coming in will now be looked at, and they'll say, we can't run a program that's not full. And so I do think that, the future, what the system looks like, again, a lot of it is going to come down to political will and what the provincial governments decide to do. My work is more at the institutional level, and what I would say we can do without knowing what the we is, right? Without that political leadership, I would say that the next little while is going to be a period of focusing on fundamentals, right? If you have a business that is struggling financially, you focus again on the fundamentals of your business. Maybe you expand it into products that aren't doing so well. Maybe you've stretched yourself too thin. I think we're going to go through a period, and I'm actually working with some clients now that are very much focusing on just getting really good at the basics, right? So what we do that's financially sound? What can we do that isn't risky? Um, which again is counter to that idea of there's money for innovation. Right now there isn't. So enrollment is a huge thing, and you certainly see in articles. There's been a few mentions in press releases from colleges where the president has said, we're going to focus on domestic recruitment. And and I actually wrote about that in my first article back a few months ago, 7 predictions for the future of post-secondary. There will be this focus on trying to get really good at getting students and then keeping students. So things we should have been doing already, like supporting students for retention.
The way I viewed the world, and it's kind of the way that you're talking about it right now. But again, a lot of people don't necessarily like the way I say it, which is, what is it that we do really, really, really well?
Hmm.
That we do it already. We've got the people, we do it really well. And what is these three other things that with this more we can also do very well? And then who wants that? And we got to be very specific because there's multiple student segments, right? And they all have different values. So we have to look at who really, really wants this well, get really granular, and then we go after them like a laser. And that's easy. It's easier said than done, I know, but I guess there's a level of surprise in my position. I just don't get why we are having conversations about you know having changing recruiting methods for domestic students. Really, I mean, there could be a digital component. I get that. I'm surprised that we are this far along and we haven't. But those schools finding different categories of students who want what they have and we're willing to pay for it, and you go and find the student. And as much as digital is important now, I think face to face is also very important. And I would have expected that to sort of already been in the system.
Yeah,
But
and I think for many institutions it has been, but again, there's quite a few that for whatever reasons, and again, it's difficult to speculate why that wasn't prioritized over time, but some are just now starting to realize the value of something like adopting strategic enrollment management, for example, or any number of frameworks or models that are proven and have been helping other institutions. There's certainly, institutions that have been doing this for a long time, but there's also quite a few now that are um, just starting to come around to the fact that we do need to change the way we do planning or the budget or um, procurement. Years ago, I worked at an institution where, procurement, again, it's a moment in time, you get different leadership in, and all of a sudden they say there's an opportunity there to look at the way we procure. And sure enough, it meant a lot of money saved in the budget. But up until then, nobody really put the spotlight on it. Um, so I think right now, the current situation is going to force a lot of institutions to say, what are others doing? What are the opportunities? And how do we become more effective, more efficient, and more competitive?
I was going to ask about government. I mean, the governments have to make some moves. But you talked about economic resiliency models not hinging on a single source of revenue, institutions which may work even in the absence of clear government direction. How do post-secondary institutions start to build economic resilience and a model which nothing can entirely work without certainty from the government, but which are best positioned to work even in an uncertain government leadership environment?
It's challenging because every province is different. Some provinces legislate that, you must balance the budget every year, and yet at the same time, and there's a long history of studies and opinion pieces on the the way that higher education funding yo-yos with the fortunes of a particular government, not just in Canada, but in the US, certainly in other parts of the world. Governments that are seeing a pretty good economy, their uh, tax contribution goes up, they might be a little more generous with post-secondary. When the economy starts to be challenged, um, post-secondary is one of the sectors they look to cut. You know, the point I was trying to get at is even without that government certainty, which just doesn't seem to exist, and we all advocate for it. We all, there's been lots and lots of discussion about um, funding models that are more predictable and steady, multi-year funding models so that you can plan beyond a year at a time. Um, but the best advice I can offer at this point is, you know, putting aside what the government might or might not do, is get your financial house in order with best practices. Really look at your budget system. Uh, there are a lot of institutions, I think, out there that, because of the relatively steady nature of the sector for years, even with
Mhm.
the government ups and downs, and because of legislation in many provinces that said you must balance the budget, they allocate everything. And well, as soon as you have a lower enrollment than projected, or the government claws a bit back, or doesn't fund your collective agreement, or whatever it is, there's just no room to maneuver. So then it's the cutting, and that's why our sector always seems to be in that cycle. The
Mhm.
more resilient institutions have really put the time and effort into understanding their finances and um, tried to take some of that uncertainty out by not having every nickel allocated to ongoing costs.
Mhm.
Well, that's tough to do because I spoke a little while ago about, particularly in community colleges that have a regional mandate, the expectation is you try to be everything to everybody. So lots of institutions have, said yes to everything they could. There's no money left over, but institutions need to really look at, is their budget strategic? Is it pride? There's some tough decisions to be made around what are their real priorities, and and they need to build in some mechanisms. And I won't get into budgeting right now, but there are ways to not be so paycheck to paycheck, to use a common
Enough.
term.
Every guest, though, I ask a question at the end, which is, and actually, this fits very nicely with your experience and your current work as a consultant. An institution comes to you, or you can pick the group of institutions you want. What are two key pieces, two, three, one, whatever, pieces of strategic advice that you believe all institutions need to really embrace?
Well, the first one is, and as difficult as it may be right now for those that are in the throes of the current reality, is don't lose sight of your future. And so, I'm doing some work around scenario planning, uh, uh, trying to imagine what the institution can be good at and how they make those changes for the future. So the big piece of advice is, no matter what's going on right now for the immediate future, set aside, create an opportunity, create some time, a venue to have those future focused conversations. Plan for, what happens after this immediate adjustment period. And then the second piece would get your house in order in terms of um, just being good at the fundamentals. And every leader that I'm aware of, they know where the opportunities are for improvement in the institution. As difficult as it may be when you're in a resource constrained environment, this is the time to get good at whether it's enrollment or retention, um, bringing your programs up to date so they are strong and viable. Maybe the curriculum hasn't been looked at for too long. It's focus on the fundamentals and focus on the future. That's what I would.
Dr. Johnson, thank you so much for joining us and providing generosity of time and expertise. For those of you, for our audience, Dr. Johnson's bio, a link to his firm will be in the comment section below. If you have any comments or ideas for new episodes, topics you'd like to talk about, put them in the comments below. Hit subscribe and like if you like this type of programming. So thank you very much, Dr. Johnson. It's
Thank
been a
you.
real pleasure. To all those watching, thank you very much and have a lovely day.
Thank you.